Dr. Jasmine Washington had dedicated her life to saving patients in the operating room, but she was about to face a different kind of challenge in Evergreen Estates. When she arrived at her new Mediterranean-style home, she noticed her new neighbors whispering, security watching her closely, and the homeowners association plotting against her. What they didn't realize was that Jasmine wasn't just another resident. She owned the entire community. Margaret Whitman, who thought she was in charge of the neighborhood, tried everything to get Jasmine to leave. She made silly complaints, conducted surprise inspections, and even called the police. But when Jasmine showed everyone the deed proving she owned the whole estate, everything changed. The neighbors who had tried to drive her out now found themselves at her mercy. Would Jasmine choose to keep them around, or was it time to make some changes? The truth was about to turn Evergreen Estates upside down. Get ready, because justice has a new landlord. Dr. Jasmine Washington stood at the grand gates of Evergreen Estates, her new Tesla Model X sparkling in the morning sun. After 15 years of studying medicine, completing her residency, and establishing herself as one of the top neurosurgeons in the country, she had finally realized her dream of living in this upscale community. The well-kept lawns and impressive homes were more than just symbols of luxury. They represented her hard work and determination. As the gates opened, Jasmine smiled, reflecting on the countless nights she spent in the operating room, saving lives and breaking barriers as one of the few black female neurosurgeons in the nation. Little did the residents of Evergreen Estates know, she wasn't just moving in. She had a brilliant plan that would soon disrupt their perfectly ordered lives. Driving into the circular driveway of her stunning Mediterranean-style mansion, Jasmine noticed neighbors peeking through their curtains. She was familiar with being watched, judged, and scrutinized. But this time felt different. This time, she held the power. As she got out of her car, she saw a neighbor walking his dog cross to the other side of the street, clutching his pet closer. Jasmine simply smiled and waved, knowing that the coming weeks would prove their biases wrong. Inside her new home, she opened her first box, which contained her medical certificates, awards, and a document that would change everything. The deed, not just to her house, but to the entire Evergreen Estates development. Sometimes, she thought, the best way to combat discrimination was to take ownership of the very ground beneath them. The news of Jasmine moving into Evergreen Estates spread quickly, creating quite a stir. Whenever she walked into the local country club, conversations stopped, and people suddenly found reasons to start whispering. There was no denying the whispers. People were not discreet at all. How could she afford to live here? This might ruin our neighborhood. Someone should check her out. Margaret Whitman, who was seen as the unofficial leader of the community, called for an urgent coffee meeting at her house. "We have to keep up our standards," she asserted to her close friends, their fancy jewelry making noise against delicate teacups. Little did Margaret know, her biased comments were being quietly recorded, with every incident noted down with dates and times. Meanwhile, Jasmine went about her daily routine, heading to the hospital each morning in her medical scrubs, doing her best to save lives no matter who her patients were. She began to notice the security guards shadowing her during her evening jogs, the way the pool seemed to be closed for repairs whenever she wanted to swim, and the anonymous notes suggesting she might feel more comfortable living somewhere else. But Jasmine had faced tougher challenges in the past. During her medical training, people often assumed she was a nurse instead of a doctor. During surgeries, some patients even asked for the real doctor until they realized that she was exactly who they needed. She learned to let her skills and achievements speak for themselves, and to turn her success into a way to prove herself. Now, as she observed the community's subtle attempts to make her feel unwelcome, she was confident that eventually they would see the truth about her place in Evergreen Estates. The Evergreen Estates Community Center was bustling with residents gathered for the monthly Homeowners Association HOA meeting. Jasmine sat quietly watching as Margaret Whitman, the HOA president, called the meeting to order. The agenda was clear, focusing on new rules about changes to people's homes, stricter checks for new residents, and concerns about safety. Margaret announced, "We've had reports of suspicious activity," her eyes fixed on Jasmine. "We need to talk about putting in more security measures to protect our community." The underlying message was obvious to everyone, especially Jasmine, who was busy taking notes on her iPad. As the floor opened for comments, hands shot up. One woman exclaimed, "My kids don't feel safe anymore," even though her children had never met Jasmine. Another resident added, "Property values are at risk," despite the fact that home prices had actually gone up since Jasmine moved in. Finally, Jasmine stood up, and the room went quiet. "I'd like to address some of these concerns," she said calmly. "As a brain surgeon who's performed over 1,000 successful surgeries, I understand the importance of safety. As a homeowner who cares about this community, I share your worries about property values. But let's be honest about what's really going on here." Before she could continue, Margaret interrupted, saying, "We're just trying to maintain the standards that make Evergreen Estates special." She said it in a way that dismissed Jasmine's comments. "Maybe if you don't appreciate our community's values, you'd be happier somewhere else." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, but Jasmine simply smiled. The time wasn't right for her to share her true thoughts. But soon enough, they would see exactly who they were dealing with. After a recent community meeting, the pressure on Jasmine to leave her neighborhood became more obvious. Someone vandalized her mailbox with offensive messages, and every day there were anonymous complaints about her yard being messy, even though she hired the same landscaping service as many of her neighbors. To make matters worse, the neighborhood security guard started to follow her car whenever she drove in or out of the community gates. One evening, after a long and tiring 12-hour surgery where she had just saved a young child's life, Jasmine returned home only to find her driveway blocked by Margaret Whitman and a few members of the Homeowners Association, HOA. "We're here for a surprise inspection," Margaret declared, waving a clipboard. "We've received a lot of complaints about your property." Jasmine stood firm, still holding her medical bag. "You're supposed to give a 24-hour notice before any inspection," she replied confidently. "That's what the neighborhood rules say." Margaret's face turned red with anger. "We can make exceptions if there are serious concerns about property values or safety," she retorted. As the confrontation continued, a crowd of neighbors started to gather, some filming the scene on their phones and others pretending to walk their dogs for the third time that night. Jasmine noticed Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor, watching the situation unfold. Mrs. Chen didn't seem to disapprove of Jasmine. Instead, she looked discontented with how Margaret and the others were behaving. "You can either let us inspect your property," Margaret threatened, "or we'll have to take more drastic measures." The threat lingered in the air, heavy with intimidation. Jasmine simply smiled, confident that she had all the necessary documents safely stored in her home. "Feel free to do whatever you think is necessary," she said calmly. "I'm eager to see what happens next." On a sunny Saturday morning, Jasmine was having a small breakfast gathering at her home for some of her colleagues from the hospital. This included doctors, nurses, and other medical staff from different backgrounds. However, when several black and brown professionals arrived at Jasmine's house, her neighbor, Margaret Whitman, became very upset. After about an hour, police cars showed up at Jasmine's home. 2 officers approached her door, looking uneasy about the situation. One officer said, "Ma'am, we received complaints about a noisy gathering and some unauthorized visitors." Behind them stood Margaret with her arms crossed, flanked by a group of nodding neighbors who supported her concerns. Jasmine's colleagues were shocked when the officers asked them to show identification. Dr. Rodriguez, the chief surgeon at the hospital, stepped forward and declared, "This is harassment. We're here for breakfast with a friend, not causing any trouble." The officers appeared uncomfortable, recognizing some of the medical professionals from their hospital work. Yet, Margaret continued her remarks, insisting, "This community has standards. We can't just have large groups of people coming in and out as they please." At that moment, Jasmine decided to take a stand. She went to her home office and returned with a folder. Calmly, she said to the officers, "I would like to file a formal complaint about harassment and discrimination. And Margaret," she added, turning to her neighbor, "I think it's time we talked about who truly belongs in Evergreen Estates." The community center was crowded once again, but this time, Jasmine stood confidently at the front. Next to her was her lawyer, a professional woman dressed in a sharp suit. The atmosphere was tense as Jasmine opened her folder and began to share her news. 6 months ago, when the previous owner of Evergreen Estates decided to sell, I saw a chance not just to buy a house, but to tackle the unfair treatment that often happens in places like this. So, instead of just buying a single home, I purchased the entire development, she announced. The crowd erupted in disbelief. Margaret Whitman, a well-known figure in the community, looked shocked. "That can't be true," she exclaimed. "We should have been informed." Jasmine's lawyer stepped in, handing out copies of the ownership documents. The sale was done through a company called Golden Future Properties. Dr. Washington is the only owner. "Now that I'm the owner," Jasmine continued, "I've kept track of every case of unfair treatment, every illegal action by the Homeowners Association, and every attempt to intimidate me and my guests. I've also heard from many other minority residents who were too scared to speak up before." She looked directly at Margaret. "The Homeowners Association is no longer in charge, effective immediately. We'll hold new elections, making sure everyone is represented fairly. Plus, I'm putting new rules in place to prevent unfair treatment, and they will be included in the community's official guide." A stunned silence fell over the room. Some residents looked embarrassed, others were furious, and a few, like Mrs. Chen and some younger families, smiled with hope. "Evergreen Estates will become a community that truly welcomes everyone," Jasmine proclaimed. "If anyone can't accept that, they're free to sell their homes, to buyers of any background, of course." As autumn settled in, Evergreen Estates underwent a remarkable change. The new Homeowners Association, HOA board, chosen by the community, showcased the growing diversity among the residents. Contrary to some fears, property values didn't drop. Instead, they increased as the neighborhood became known for being open-minded and friendly to everyone. Jasmine took the lead in organizing the first-ever Evergreen Estates Cultural Festival, where neighbors came together to share their traditions, delicious foods, and personal stories. Mrs. Chen offered classes on making dumplings, while the Rodriguez family taught salsa dancing. Children played on lawns where people had once reported suspicious behavior, now filled with laughter and fun. Not all changes were easy. Some long-term residents struggled to accept the new ideas and still clung to their old ways of thinking. However, they became the minority, and their outdated views quickly faced disapproval from the community. The security cameras that had previously monitored Jasmine now worked to keep all residents safe and secure. One day, Margaret Whitman returned to oversee her move out of the neighborhood. When she saw Jasmine in her garden, she approached with some hesitation. "I was wrong," she admitted. "I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment." Jasmine graciously accepted the apology, understanding that recognizing mistakes is an important step toward positive change. As new families moved in, attracted by the community's welcoming spirit, Jasmine felt her dream coming to life. Evergreen Estates was evolving into the kind of community that celebrates excellence, achievement, and humanity, no matter a person's race, religion, or background. The transformation of Evergreen Estates gained a lot of attention in the media. Local news stations featured stories about the community's inspiring journey, while real estate magazines highlighted how inclusive policies improved property values. Jasmine, a key figure in this change, began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about community growth and the fight against housing discrimination. Soon, even other exclusive neighborhoods reached out for advice on how to implement similar changes. Jasmine teamed up with civil rights lawyers to create a plan that could help communities across the country become more inclusive. Inspired by her efforts, her medical colleagues also began investigating discrimination issues within their hospitals. Jasmine's story even reached the state government, where she spoke out about housing discrimination and the urgent need to enforce fair housing laws more effectively. Her experiences as both a successful professional and a victim of discrimination made her testimony powerful. This led to new legislation being proposed, which was named the Washington Fair Housing Act in her honor. In Evergreen Estates, the positive changes kept rolling in. The community newsletter, once filled with complaints about property issues, now celebrated the accomplishments of residents and their contributions through service. The tennis club organized youth clinics for underprivileged kids, and the community pool became a welcoming space for families from diverse backgrounds. Jasmine's initial investment not only grew financially, but also created significant social change. She proved that standing up against discrimination could lead to successful outcomes, showing that sometimes the best way to respond is through positive action and change. 1 year after her big revelation, Jasmine found herself back at the gates of Evergreen Estates. The morning sun sparkled on the beautiful metalwork, but so much had changed since she was last there. The guard greeted her with a warm smile as she entered. Outside, children from different backgrounds played together on the neat lawns, and pride flags waved proudly alongside American flags on several homes. In her rearview mirror, Jasmine noticed a moving truck pulling up, new neighbors arriving. She couldn't help but think about her own arrival and how different these newcomers' welcome would be. The Community Welcome Committee, led by Mrs. Chen, would greet them with kindness and food, rather than the suspicion and unfriendliness she had faced. Later that evening, during a community dinner celebrating the positive changes in Evergreen Estates, Jasmine took in the diverse faces filling the community center. There was Dr. Rodriguez, now leading the HOA board, chatting with a new resident about school choices. Over there, Mrs. Chen's grandchildren performed a traditional dance, winning cheerful applause from everyone. A young black couple approached Jasmine, the wife clearly expecting a baby. "We chose Evergreen Estates because of you," said the husband. "You showed us that change can happen." Jasmine smiled, remembering her own hopes of finding a place where she truly belonged. As she drove home that night, passing houses that glowed with warm lights and filled with families from all walks of life living together in peace, Jasmine felt proud of how far they had all come. When she had first bought her home in Evergreen Estates, it was to make a statement against discrimination. But now, she had built something even more precious, a real community. Sometimes she realized the best way to make the world a better place is to start right where you live.